What happens when corrupt cops think they can get away with framing an innocent person? What if that person is a powerful figure? A black woman is framed. They think they can bury her. They don't know who they're dealing with. Stay until the end to see justice served. The late afternoon sun cast long golden streaks across the quiet highway cutting through Rockford County, Alabama. The sky burned in hues of orange and deep violet, a stark contrast to the stillness of the rural landscape. Naomi Carter kept one hand steady on the wheel of her black Dodge Charger, the rhythmic hum of the engine the only sound in the otherwise silent drive. It had been a long day, longer than she wanted. Naomi had spent hours in a federal courtroom testifying in a high-stakes drug trafficking case, one that had taken months of undercover work to build. The kind of case that made enemies. The kind that sent ripples through the networks of those who thrived in the shadows. Though she was used to this part of the job, exhaustion clung to her like a second skin. She just wanted to get home, but something felt off. Her eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. For the past 5 miles, a black and white patrol car had been tailing her, keeping just the right distance. No sirens, no flashing lights. No attempt to pull her over, just following. Watching. Naomi exhaled slowly through her nose. She had been in law enforcement long enough to recognize when a traffic stop was routine and when it wasn't. This wasn't about a busted taillight or speeding. This was a game. She kept her speed steady at 55 miles per hour, exactly within the limit. If they were looking for a reason to stop her, she wasn't going to hand it to them. Her fingers tapped lightly on the steering wheel, the only outward sign of her growing suspicion. She knew how these small-town cops operated. Some thrived on power, on the idea that they controlled their own little kingdom, unchecked and unquestioned. Others, they were worse. They took bribes, played dirty, made people disappear. Naomi had spent years dealing with criminals of all kinds. Some of the most dangerous ones wore badges. Just as she predicted, the patrol car's red and blue lights flashed on behind her, flooding the darkening road with urgency. There it was, the moment of truth. She sighed, more annoyed than anything else. This was about to get messy. Keeping her movements deliberate, Naomi signaled, eased onto the gravel shoulder and turned off the engine. Her hands stayed on the wheel. She knew the drill. Stay calm, stay in control, give them nothing. Outside, 2 shadowed figures stepped out of the patrol car, their boots crunching against the gravel as they approached. Naomi didn't flinch. She was ready. The gravel beneath Naomi Carter's tires crunched softly as her car settled on the roadside. 2 officers approached from opposite sides, their postures relaxed yet deliberate. She kept her hands on the wheel, her breathing slow, measured. The first officer, Travis Reynolds, moved like a man who enjoyed the game of power. Lean, sharp-eyed, with the cocky smirk of someone who had done this many times before. The second, Carl Matheson, was built like a brick wall, older, heavier, and carrying an air of aggressive impatience. Reynolds knocked on the window with 2 fingers. Naomi rolled it down smoothly, her expression unreadable. "Evening, officer," she greeted, voice level. Reynolds didn't bother responding. Instead, he held out a hand. License and registration. Naomi reached for the glove compartment, her movements slow, practiced. She retrieved the documents and handed them over. Reynolds took them without glancing, flipping through lazily before looking back at her. "You in a hurry, ma'am?" Naomi met his gaze. "No," he hummed, then cocked his head. "That's so, you didn't see that stop sign back there." Her grip on the wheel tightened slightly. There was no stop sign. Her silence was enough. Reynolds' smirk widened. "Step out of the vehicle, ma'am." Naomi's brows lifted slightly. "On what grounds?" Reynolds leaned in, his sunglasses sliding lower on his nose. "We'll discuss that outside the vehicle." She held her position. "I'm fine discussing it right here." The amusement in Reynolds' face didn't falter. If anything, it deepened. "I'd hate for this to get difficult, ma'am." Matheson shifted behind her, his heavy boots scraping against the gravel. She had seconds to decide her next move. Naomi exhaled slowly. Then, deliberately, she unbuckled her seatbelt and stepped out. Matheson moved immediately, circling behind her. "Turn around, hands behind your back." Naomi's jaw tightened. "Excuse me." Reynolds took a step closer, invading her space. "You got drugs in that car, don't you?" The absurdity almost made her laugh. She squared her shoulders. "You're joking, right?" Neither of them smiled. "Turn around, ma'am." She didn't move. "I'm a federal agent. My badge is in the—" Matheson grabbed her wrist. Naomi's instincts kicked in before logic. She twisted her arm free, stepping back. Matheson's face darkened. "That's assault on an officer," Reynolds barked. Before she could respond, Matheson snatched her arm again, this time wrenching it behind her back. The sharp bite of steel cuffs clamped onto her wrists. Naomi's heart pounded, not in fear but in fury. Reynolds yanked open her car door while Matheson tightened his grip on her. The trunk popped open. Naomi didn't need to see it. She knew exactly what they were about to find. Reynolds whistled, low and amused. Well, look what we got here." Matheson grinned, stepping forward. "Ain't that a shame?" Naomi glanced over her shoulder. Reynolds held up a vacuum-sealed brick of drugs. Meth, most likely. Something easy to pin. Her fingers curled into fists behind her back. This wasn't sloppiness. This was routine. Reynolds smirked, tossing the brick in his hands before pocketing her DEA badge. "You were saying something about being a federal agent." Matheson laughed. "Yeah, looks like we got ourselves a trafficker instead." Naomi's blood burned. They thought they could bury her. They had no idea who they were dealing with. The ride to the Rockford County Sheriff's Department was long, silent, and filled with an unsettling tension. Naomi Carter sat in the back of the patrol car, her wrists bound behind her with cold steel cuffs that bit into her skin. Outside, the town rolled past, small businesses, dusty convenience stores, and a few wandering pedestrians who barely spared a glance at the squad car. She wasn't panicked. She wasn't scared. She was furious. Matheson drove, humming off-key, while Reynolds sat in the passenger seat, occasionally glancing back at her through the rearview mirror. "You look mighty quiet back there, lady," Reynolds said, his voice smug. Naomi ignored him. That only seemed to amuse him further. "Guess there ain't much to say when you get caught red-handed, huh?" Naomi kept her gaze locked on the passing scenery. She had nothing to say to them. Not yet. The Rockford County Sheriff's Department looked as outdated as the system it operated under. A low-slung brick building, cracked pavement out front, and a single flickering security light over the entrance. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the scent of cheap coffee, sweat, and something vaguely metallic. Behind the front desk, a grizzled desk sergeant glanced up briefly, but didn't react as Reynolds shoved Naomi forward. Standing behind the counter, Sheriff Frank Douglas barely looked up from his paperwork. Douglas was in his late 50s with a broad frame, graying hair, and the demeanor of a man who had long since stopped caring. His uniform was wrinkled, his badge dulled, and the permanent bags under his eyes suggested a lifetime of looking the other way. Douglas sighed, rubbing a hand down his face. "What's this?" Reynolds tossed Naomi's badge onto the desk. "Trafficking case, boss. Fake DEA credentials." Douglas barely glanced at the badge before grunting. "For Christ's sake, Reynolds, another one." "This one's the real deal, boss," Matheson said with a grin. "Big-time player." Douglas exhaled sharply, flipping through the paperwork Reynolds handed him. Then, without looking at Naomi, he waved them off. "Put her in holding." The metal bars clanged shut behind her. The holding cell was small, dimly lit, with cracked cinder block walls and a single metal bench bolted to the floor. The air was thick with stale sweat and despair. Across the cell, a young black man sat on the floor, his knees drawn up, head resting against the wall. His dark eyes flicked up to meet hers. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then he huffed out a dry laugh. "Let me guess. Reynolds and Matheson." Naomi leaned against the cool metal bench. "Close." He nodded knowingly. "Figures, same playbook." Naomi studied him. He looked exhausted. His left eye was slightly swollen, a bruise creeping along his cheekbone. "What's your name?" she asked. "Elijah Brooks." "How long have you been here?" he sighed, rolling his shoulders. 4 days, no phone call, no lawyer. My mom doesn't even know where I am." Naomi's jaw clenched. She had seen too many cases like this. "And what did they say you did?" Elijah let out a hollow laugh. "Take your pick. Said my taillight was out. Then suddenly I had suspicious amounts of cash in my glove box. I work in a warehouse. Been saving for months. Funny thing is, by the time we got here, that cash was gone." Naomi didn't react, but inside her rage simmered. "They do this often?" she asked. Elijah scoffed. "All the time. Pick the right person, someone who won't be missed, someone who won't be believed. They make a little money, throw some people in a cage, and the system swallows them up." Naomi exhaled. This was bigger than just her. Bootsteps echoed in the hallway. Naomi looked up just as Reynolds and Matheson strolled toward the cell, their faces plastered with arrogant smirks. Reynolds tapped the bars with his knuckle. "How's the accommodations, sweetheart?" Naomi didn't answer. Matheson snorted. "Oh, she's one of those, huh? Thinks she's too good to talk." Reynolds chuckled. "You know, for a second back there, you almost had me believing that fake-ass badge." Naomi's expression didn't change. "Read the badge, genius." Reynolds smirked. "Oh, I read it." He leaned in slightly. "And guess what? In about 24 hours, that fancy DEA title ain't gonna mean a damn thing." Matheson chuckled. "Yeah, you see, lady, this is Rockford County, and in Rockford County you don't get to win." Naomi's stomach tightened, not with fear but with rage. They really thought they could bury her, that no one would come looking. She smiled. Just a little. Enough to make Reynolds pause. His smirk faltered. "You think this is funny?" he snapped. Naomi's voice was calm, deliberate. "I think you're an idiot." The way his jaw clenched, the way Matheson's smirk twitched, she had gotten to them. But for now, she let them believe they were winning. Because when the tables turned, she was going to bury them instead. The clock inside the DEA field office in Birmingham ticked past midnight. Deputy Director Henry Lawson leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, his sharp eyes fixed on the empty seat at the conference table. Naomi Carter hadn't checked in. That wasn't like her. She had testified in court that afternoon, but when her shift ended, she should have reported back. No calls, no messages, nothing. Lawson wasn't the kind of man to panic. He believed in protocol, but he also believed in his instincts, and right now they were screaming that something was wrong. He turned to his assistant. "Pull her GPS logs." Minutes later, the answer appeared on screen, Rockford County Sheriff's Department. Lawson's jaw tightened. He had worked long enough to know exactly what that meant. He picked up the phone and dialed the station. A lazy, uninterested voice answered. "Rockford County Sheriff's Department." Lawson's voice was like steel. "I'm looking for Special Agent Naomi Carter. She was last tracked at your station." The line went silent for just a second too long. Then came the lie. "No one by that name here." Click. The dial tone buzzed in Lawson's ear. His stomach coiled with rage. He turned to his team. "Suit up. Now." The roar of engines shattered the silence of Rockford County as a fleet of black SUVs tore down the highway. Inside, a dozen federal agents sat locked and loaded, their expressions grim and focused. Lawson, seated at the front, checked his watch. They were out of time. By now, the local cops would have had hours to do whatever they wanted. He knew their type, dirty, arrogant, thinking they were untouchable. They were about to learn otherwise. The SUV skidded into the station's parking lot, tires screeching against the pavement. Doors slammed open. Lawson led the charge. "Federal agents, everyone stand down." Inside, chaos erupted. Sheriff Douglas jerked up from his desk, eyes wide. Reynolds and Matheson, standing near the holding cells, froze mid-conversation. For a second, no one moved. Then Reynolds reached for his gun. "Don't!" Lawson's voice cut through the room like a blade. Half a dozen agents had their weapons locked on the two officers, fingers hovering over triggers. Matheson's face drained of color. Reynolds' hand twitched, then dropped. They knew. They had lost. Naomi sat on the metal bench, arms folded as she listened to the commotion outside her cell. Then she heard it, heavy boots, the unmistakable click of safeties being flipped off, a voice she knew well. "Where the hell is my agent?" Naomi smirked. "Right on time." Moments later, her cell door swung open. Deputy Director Henry Lawson stood there, his expression unreadable. But Naomi could see it, the cold fury in his eyes. He turned to Reynolds and Matheson, his voice a low, controlled growl. "Uncover, now." Matheson hesitated. "Sir, we—" Lawson's voice cut like ice. "I said uncover." Slowly, Matheson reached for his keys and unlocked Naomi's cuffs. She rubbed her wrists, stepping past them without a word. She didn't need to say anything. Their fate was already sealed. The air inside the Rockford County Courthouse was thick with tension. The old wood-paneled walls seemed to trap the heat, making the atmosphere feel claustrophobic. The scent of burnt coffee and stale paper lingered, mixing with the quiet murmurs of the courtroom. Naomi Carter sat at the defendant's table, calm, composed, and waiting. She wasn't worried. This wasn't her first courtroom, but it would be the first time the real criminals were sitting on the wrong side of the law. Across the room, Travis Reynolds and Carl Matheson sat stiffly, their uniforms pressed, but their faces tense. Their lawyer, a local defense attorney who looked like he wanted to be anywhere else, whispered furiously between them. At the prosecutor's table, District Attorney Scott Weathers stood, adjusting his tie before facing the judge. "Your Honor, the state formally charges Naomi Carter with drug trafficking, possession with intent to distribute, and resisting arrest." A hushed murmur rippled through the crowd. The judge, an older man with silver hair and piercing eyes, turned to Naomi. "Miss Carter, do you have legal representation?" Naomi leaned forward, her voice steady. "That won't be necessary, Your Honor." A ripple of whispers spread through the courtroom. The prosecutor frowned. The judge eyed her carefully before nodding. "Very well. How do you plead?" Naomi stood. Instead of answering, she reached into the folder in front of her and pulled out a laminated ID. She stepped forward and placed it on the judge's desk. Silence. The judge picked it up, his eyes narrowing slightly. Then his expression shifted. His gaze flicked to the prosecutor. The man leaned forward, peering at the badge, confusion settling over his features. "What is that?" he asked. The judge set it down with a sigh. Then he turned to Reynolds and Matheson. His entire demeanor changed. "This is a federal badge," the judge announced, his voice echoing through the room. "Miss Carter is a special agent with the DEA." The entire courtroom fell silent. Reynolds' face drained of color. Matheson gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white. Naomi's voice was smooth, controlled. "That's correct, Your Honor. And if the prosecution wants to continue pressing charges against a federal agent who was framed by two corrupt officers, I'd be happy to proceed." The prosecutor's face twisted in horror. "Your Honor, The judge held up a hand, cutting him off. Then his sharp gaze turned to Reynolds and Matheson. "Would either of you like to explain yourselves?" Reynolds shifted in his seat. "Your Honor, we were acting on probable cause." Naomi let out a sharp, humorless laugh. Probable cause, you had nothing. Her voice cut through the courtroom like a blade. You pulled me over because you thought you could get away with it, and you almost did. The judge's expression hardened. He turned to the prosecutor. I assume you'll be dropping all charges. The prosecutor, looking sick, nodded. Yes, Your Honor, the judge exhaled. Good. Miss Carter, you're free to go. A wave of relief washed over the crowd, but Naomi wasn't finished. She turned, her gaze locking onto Reynolds and Matheson. Now let's talk about what happens to dirty cops who frame innocent people. Reynolds swallowed hard. Matheson's jaw twitched. Then the courtroom doors swung open. A U.S. Marshal stepped inside, followed by two men in suits. The lead agent, Special Investigator Troy Dawson, strode forward and held up a sealed warrant. Judge, we have federal arrest warrants for Officers Travis Reynolds and Carl Matheson on charges of conspiracy, evidence tampering, and multiple civil rights violations. Reynolds staggered back. You set us up, Naomi laughed. No, you set yourselves up, Matheson shot to his feet. You can't do this. The marshal stepped forward, cuffs already in hand. Actually, we can. Reynolds lunged for the door. He didn't get far. Two deputies intercepted him, slamming him face first against the courtroom table. His own cuffs clicked shut around his wrists. Matheson stood frozen, his hands trembling. The marshal grabbed his arm, twisting it behind his back. Carl Matheson, you're under arrest. The courtroom erupted. The audience, locals who had suffered under these corrupt officers, whispered, gasped, some even clapped. Naomi exhaled slowly. It was over. Justice had been served. The hallways of the courthouse buzzed with lingering energy. The weight of justice, rare and unexpected, had shifted the air. Naomi Carter stood near the exit, arms crossed, watching as Elijah Brooks stepped forward, his shackles removed. His eyes flickered with disbelief. A federal agent stood beside him, confirming, all charges have been dropped. Your record is cleared. Elijah let out a shaky breath. Relief was there, but something else too, anger, exhaustion, understanding. He turned to Naomi. This happens a lot, doesn't it? His voice was quiet but edged with something sharp. Naomi didn't lie. Yeah, it does. He studied her for a moment, then she added, but not today. Elijah nodded, something settling in his expression, not just relief, but determination. As he walked out, Naomi turned toward the courthouse steps. This wasn't just about two dirty cops. It was about the system that let them exist, that let them thrive. Naomi knew this fight wasn't over. But today they lost. And tomorrow, she'd make sure the next ones did too.